Hello. Whoa, that was a bit loud. Hi, everybody. Welcome here. Come on through. If you're still in the kitchen, it's time to put that cup of tea down, or you feel free to bring it with you. First of all, I'm just going to introduce myself because there's a whole bunch of people here who are not normally at CPS meetings, which is a cool thing. So I'm Ian Walls. I'm the president at CPS, and I sent the invitation to Photosynthesis to come and listen to Stuart because it's really cool. How this came about was that we had a hole in the program that didn't get filled, that we thought had been filled, and I'd been overseas and somebody else hadn't done this, and it never happened until last week when we were going, what's going on? So I went home from last week's weekend going, hell, what are we going to do next week? And then I got an email from Stuart in the morning saying, do you want me to do a talk? So I said, yes, please. So here he is. First of all, though, there's a bunch of people who haven't been at the CWEA, so I just want to do a quick where is everything and health and safety type briefing. If you want to get out, quickly these two doors here will take you straight out into the driveway, and then the meeting is out the front. You can also go out the back or through the doors that you came in. Across the hall, there's a bunch of first aid gear and fire extinguishers, etc., and the toilets are through there. And in the kitchen, which is not a kitchen, it's now going to become a developing area, so we'll all be there in a minute. So that's where that is, and obviously this is where CPS meet, so anybody's here from Photosynthesis wants to come along again another time, again you're more than welcome, so the more the merrier. So I'm going to leave it to Stuart to run through his process.
Thanks. Am I on? Yes. Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. All right, carbon printing. Anyone seen this before? Our busy age does not have time to read, but it has time to look. Came across it last night. Theophile Gautier. Any idea when he said that? What do you think? 700s. Sorry? 700s. 700s? 1800s, sorry. No, a bit later than that.
19th century?
1858. And it was around the time photography was kicking off. But it could have been said today or yesterday, couldn't it? Yeah, interesting. Anyway, carbon transfer printing. So I'm going to read my notes because I'm going to forget what I meant to say. So, okay. A little bit about me. Photographing for, probably 30 years, I suppose. A little bit of film, then went digital. Now sort of gone back to film. So, and I've always printed my work, inkjet prints and then transfers, and now I'm into these alternative processes. I just really enjoy that making side of it. I need to get out and make more photographs so I can get more to print, because sometimes, you can only print so many of the same image, but I do that. So I really enjoy the printing. Carbon printing for probably the last 4 or 5 years. And we'll get into what it is in a minute, but it's always been a process that I thought was sort of out of reach in terms of it is quite time consuming, and there's quite a few steps to it. So tonight, a bit of history of the process, what the process actually is, how we're using it today, or most people are using it today, and then a bit of magic. So I bought a couple of prints that are ready to develop, so we'll see how they go. I think I said to Ian, it's either going to be 5 minutes and it's all down the sink, or it's going to be 20 minutes and there might be a picture at the end of it, so we shall see. Can never guarantee. So what is carbon printing? Carbon transfer print is made entirely from pigment and gelatin. So these are all carbon prints on the wall. So the actual image itself is gelatin with a pigment, carbon black it was in the day, or a watercolor pigment today. That's all what the print is made of. There's no silvers, there's no dyes, and it will last for centuries. So the permanence is one of the attractions of the process too, and we'll touch on that a little bit later too. In fact, it was born in the mid-19th century to solve one of photography's biggest problems, and that was fading prints. So the process uses UV light to make the exposure, and through a negative, it'll harden that sensitized gelatin in relation to how much light it receives. So the more light it gets, the harder it gets. And when we come to develop the print, we'll use hot water to wash away what's not been hardened. And that's the bit, hopefully we'll see a bit later. And when you do look at the prints, and quite happy for you to lift them off the rack, just hold them by the mat, because it really is when you see the surface texture, that's what's, yeah, that's the beauty and that's the attraction. Some of them don't have the relief and some of them do. And it all depends on the papers that you use and the process that you're doing. So, and it's a bit like salt and pepper. Some people like it, some people don't like it, but I like it, and yeah. Why carbon printing? Archival permanence. There's pigment and gelatin. There's no silver. There's no dyes, as I mentioned. So it'll last for hundreds of years. It's got a long tonal scale. So what we mean by that is it's got shadow detail and smooth highlights. And I always like to think of it as how many cranes I've got in my box, or how many black and grey cranes I've got. It's got a lot of cranes. So it can really pick up some quite subtle shadow detail through to some soft, delicate highlights. Making the most of that is the trick, I suppose. Well, that's where, but it does have a very long tonal scale. I think some of those prints will show, particularly, you know, there's a couple of skies on the left-hand side, so you can sort of see that, yeah, almost whispering into the greys and then into the blacks. Any pigment colours possible? So lamp black was used in the day. So that's when you burn a candle or a lamp. If you put a piece of glass or metal above the flame, you'll catch the soot. And it's the soot or that carbon was what was used at the very beginning of these carbon prints. Or you can use, again, other colours, other pigment colours. The problem with fading. Well, the 1950s prints were albumin prints or salted paper prints. So these were silver nitrate or silver salt prints, and they were fading. They're turning yellow. They weren't lasting. And it was the London Photographic Society, later the Royal Photographic Society, established a fading committee, 1855. And really they put committees set up to investigate how to improve the permanence of photographs or the prints, how to make them last. And at the same time, in France, Honoré d'Albert Delouis, he ran an 11-year contest to find a truly permanent photographic printing process, and he offered a prize of 8,000 francs, which in today's money is $70,000. So that's, I guess, how serious they were. They wanted a photograph that would last. So really looking for that permanence, that permanent photographic process. Alphonse Poincaré, he discovered that gelatin, when gelatin is sensitized with a dichromate and exposed to light or UV light, it will actually, the dichromate will break down and cross-link the gelatin or harden that gelatin. And then you can wash away what's not been hardened with hot water. So then you're left with the print. But the problem was he was using what was called direct carbon. So he's putting the pigment and the gelatin on the paper, exposing it, and then trying to wash off what's not been hardened. And if you think of it like a freezing pond, it'll freeze from the top down. So when you put the gelatin tissue, as it's called, onto the paper, it's going to harden on the surface and not harden so much as it gets closer to the paper itself. So trying to wash away what's not been hardened without washing away the top layer was really difficult. And it wasn't until 1864 when Joseph Swan patented the transfer method. So he figured out that after the exposure, if you then transferred it to another piece of paper, you've then reversed it. You've now got that soft gelatin on the top, which is then easier to wash away. So really, that was, you know, in hindsight, it looks, yeah, okay. It took them 9 years, but he patented that process. And actually started making commercially made gelatin tissues for that reason. And that's what we want, commercialized the whole process, made it repeatable. Why is it such a big deal? Transferring the undeveloped image to the final support before warm water development. So those most fragile, lightly exposed areas were easier to wash away and still leave the hardened gelatin underneath. It also meant you could transfer it to different materials. So not just paper, but I'm using glass, I'm trying some metal. You sort of size the receiving paper or the glass or the metal, either with a gelatin size, and the gelatin to gelatin will stick and bond. So you don't have to just use paper, you can transfer it to other substrates too. Mono to colour. So 1868, Louis de Haron was making colour prints, which some of these are using that same process. So he was shooting using black and white emulsion and making colour prints. So by taking exposures through red, green and blue filters onto black and white negatives, and then exposing cyan, yellow, magenta tissues with those three negatives, and then putting them together, you'd end up with a full colour print. And that's how those colour prints have been. So the bottom ones particularly are trichromes. So they're black and white negatives, shot through red, green and blue filters, and then printed in the corresponding tissue colours, and then sandwiched together. That's the basis of colour photography. So even today your colour film is made up of different layers or different dyes to act as the red, green and blue filters. And even your digital cameras, I think I've got red, green and blue pixels to capture the different parts of the spectrum. Peak and decline. Platinum printing also came out in the late 19th century. And that was a very permanent process too. It's very expensive, the platinum salts, but carbon was 3 times more expensive just because of the time involved to make it. And in the beginning of the First World War, platinum was then used in the munitions factories. So platinum became very scarce, or you couldn't use platinum or palladium. And that's really where the silver gelatin and today, well, traditional darkroom or silver gelatin papers took off. And carbon printing just declined, just because it was so time-consuming. The commercial papers or the tissues that people were using weren't available anymore. So it wasn't really until the late 1960s, 1970s that people started to explore it again. But they had to make their own materials from all the raw materials. Overview of the process. So I don't know why they call them a tissue. But this is, you can pass this around, this is just the magenta tissue. So this is just pigment and gelatin. There's some sugar in there too to keep it flexible. And a bit of preservative, otherwise it does go mouldy, which I learned pretty quickly. So that's what we call the tissue. I think on the next few I might show some pictures. So once that's dried as it is, we then sensitize it. So I'll brush on a dichromic solution. That will make it light sensitive. And I'm using digital negatives. So even though I'm using film camera, the size of the print is the size of the negative. So to get a 8x10 print, I need an 8x10 negative. I don't have an 810 camera, but I do have smaller formats. So I'll scan my film into Photoshop, and I'll enlarge in Photoshop, and do any dodging, burning, any contrast tones. And then I'll print off a digital negative using my inkjet printer. So this is a digital negative. Again, pass that around. So it's a transparency. I think it's a scene of a pool in a river. So that's my negative, and that's what I've put on top of my sensitized tissue and expose it under some UV light. Once I've finished exposure, I'll then transfer it to its final paper, which is what you'll see next door. And then after about 10 minutes, I can then wash off in hot water. I'll be able to wash off the unhardened gelatin. Show some pictures, it's easier. So it's a bit like making a cake. There's a bit of a recipe. That's my top corner there, sort of You've got to melt the gelatin, 34, 35 degrees, and then bring in the pigment, add some sugar. And to get rid of the bubbles, I add some isopropyl alcohol as well, so that gets rid of the bubbles. Might brew for maybe an hour, 2 hours. And then on the right-hand side, you can see me pouring the tissue. Black in that case, and I actually use some metal strips around the edge to make like a weir, so I can actually keep it in that space.
What do you use for the pigments, Stuart?
I'm using ink in this one, yeah, India ink, yeah. And not all India inks are the same, that's interesting. I've got one tonight I haven't really seen, so I'll be interested to see what colour it is. They're not black, they're various shades of chocolate brown to maybe grey if you're lucky, but watercolour pigments, I've tried gouache as well. And there is 1 or 2 people in the world actually making their own pigments. So they're crushing rocks, making their own pigments. We'll see, one day I might try that. And on the bottom you can see the tissues are hanging up. They take about 2 or 3 days to dry. And they're quite, probably a good 2 or 3 mils thick when they're poured. And you'll see that one going around. When it's dried down, it's probably about 0.8 of a millimetre. So it's a lot of, it's about 10% gelatin, so there's a lot of water to evaporate off. And they'll hang there for about 2 or 3 days. I've got a bit of a dehumidifier going and a fan. What I learnt very quickly is if I didn't have the dehumidifier going and they took too long to dry, they actually started going mouldy. I'd come down and find mould spores all over them. So. And I've actually started putting a preservative in them as well. That's a thymol preservative. So those are my tissues. Those are the prints exposing. So again, with my negative, I've sensitized my tissue, put my negative on top. Under a UV light source, there's a piece of, I guess, heavy glass to try and keep it flat and keep it in contact. That's my sunbed on the top left, which I've probably used for the last 8, 9 years. It's getting a bit dodgy, so I've made an LED light box. It probably uses a fraction of the power, and the output is pretty consistent, so I actually go off a time now rather than trying to measure the exposure. So I'm in the process of moving to that little LED box. Or you can use the sun. Yeah, it's a bit difficult without some way of measuring how much UV light, because clouds come and go, and I did start using the sun a long time ago, but I found that sunbeds are a lot more consistent. Digital negatives for precision, what have I got? So in terms of colour photography, which I don't do, well, I haven't done a lot of, which is why I'm really wanting to try and get into colour, either using trichromes or shooting colour film. So to make my CMYK separations, I'm using Photoshop. So if you've explored Photoshop, you'll find in the actions palette, I think it is, not actions, the channels, you convert your image to a YMCK profile, and then your channels palette, you'll be able to split those channels. And it'll actually split it into CMYK monochrome images, which you can then invert and make negatives with. So that's what I'm doing. And the order in which I print them is yellow, magenta, cyan, and black. The yellow's on the bottom because it's quite opaque. So as we go up through magenta, cyan, and black, they're more transparent. So I've never tried it the other way, but that's what everyone does. So because yellow is quite opaque, magenta, then cyan, and then black. Days of work, yeah, maybe a week. The tissues take 2 or 3 days to dry, maybe a day or 2 to make a full print. So that's if it goes right first time. But that's part of the joy too, and I think I've mentioned earlier too. It's frustrating when it doesn't work, but when it does work, it's your hairs stand up and it's pretty magic. Yeah. What else have we got? There's my UV light source. So we talked about once that tissue's been exposed, the transfer step. So this is the transfer step. So that black tissue has been re-soaked in a water bath to rehydrate it, and it's being placed on the existing print. So that print there has had yellow, magenta, and cyan, and this will be the last black layer coming on top. So it's literally just folded down, and then with the squeegee, it's then squeegeed out to get rid of all the air. If you don't get rid of all the air, you get little bubbles. we shall see. We might have, we'll see. You can, yeah, tried a few different techniques. I flood it with water. Some people mate it under the, in the water itself and under the water, but I find that really awkward. So I found that the most repeatable way. So that's putting the black tissue down, and it's called mating. So squeegeeing out all of the water, and then I usually let it rest for 10 or so minutes, and then we'll take it through to development. So then in a hot water bath at about 42 degrees C, after about 4 or 5 minutes, you can peel off the tissue, and it will leak. Well, that substrate is actually a Yupo paper or a plastic paper, so you can actually peel it off after about 5 minutes, and then another 10 or 15 minutes with some agitation, the hot water will wash away that unhardened gelatin, leaving behind your print if you're lucky. So that was his black layer. So these aren't my images, but it does. Yeah, it's quite amazing some of the stuff he had. This was the end of a 3-day workshop, and by the time you get to the end of 3 days, you've got a bit of a production line going, because you want to finish at 5 o'clock and finish all your prints that you've started 3 days ago. So in the first top one here, he's got the magenta layer that's just waiting to be developing. It's being washed off. The next one down, he's actually got the mated tissue waiting for the 5 minutes before he can peel the top layer off. He's got one sitting in cold water, which is probably washing, and he's getting another one ready to mate on the back bench. So yeah, it's quite interesting. The first day or two, it's sort of pretty slow, and then all of a sudden, it's sort of like a steam train as they all start coming through, and yeah, a bit of a choreography, really. So yeah, good fun. Some of the images he were printing, so this has some amazing texture, and you'll see. In fact, I should be handing these around. Just hand those around. You can rub them and put your fingers on them, and if you get the light, and you'll certainly feel the texture. So if we print on these are fixed out photographic papers, so I tend to use that. Well, in fact, that's what I use, because they're machine coated gelatin papers. It's one less variable I need to worry about. So I use photographic paper, fix out all the silver, and depending if I'm using a gloss paper, you can get quite a bit of relief. Or a matte paper, you'll see some of those. Those 3 on the bottom left are matte papers. You don't get quite as much relief, but you'll get a differential between the shadows and the highlights. So the shadows are quite glossy or got a bit of sheen, and the highlights are quite flat. Inkjet printing terms, I think it's called gloss differential, and it's a no-no, but I think it's pretty fantastic. So, a couple of those prints on the top middle row on the right, they're on textured paper. So textured paper, you don't get any relief at all. But what I like about them is those shadows. They're really quite juicy, detailed shadows, quite rich, but you lose the texture. So it's horses for courses. What else? There's a couple there. There's one there on metal. That was actually, yeah, so it's again, take them off the shelf. There's quite a bit of relief to that one, again, because it's a very hard surface, so it keeps the relief.
Stuart, how do you hold register?
I'll show you. It'd be easier to show you. I use some pins and a hole punch. So I've worked out a way that most of the time that seems to work, yeah. Particularly when you're doing the 4 colours, yeah, you keep register. Those 4 black ones hanging up there, again, they're carbon prints, they're on glass. And it's actually sitting behind the glass. And behind that, I put another gelatin, pigmented gelatin layer too. They're called orotones, after Curtis. Photographer in the late 1900s took a lot of images of the American Indians using a process termed the Curtis process, but it's simply an orotone process. So, but again, if you get the light as you move around those, the pigment on the back is an interference pigment, so you'll get a change of hue, which is really quite fascinating. And there's one very small gold print on the bottom. Again, that's come off the glass, so again you get the relief. So you not only get the the interference of the light with the pigment behind the print, but you actually got the relief on the print too. So, time for some magic. Any immediate questions, I guess, before we can go next door as well. But I didn't show. Put those around too. Again, you can have a feel of those. So you can get a lot of relief. In fact, you can get so much relief it's buckled the paper. I've not done that since, but yeah. So I have it's quite cool. But and again, that was probably one of the first colour prints I was able to make too. So again, you can see. Again, this is actually on that plastic Yupo paper. So again, you haven't got quite the relief, but the density in the colours is quite cool. So.
You're doing it. The camera uses the system of filters. Would you just use black and white as the key plate? Like if you were doing your own.
I'm playing with colour film.
Oh, you're doing colour.
And I am, but I do like the trichrome. The palette is quite cool. It's a combination of the pigments I'm using as much as the, But again, things move, so you'll see, particularly those bottom ones, if things move in between the exposures, you get some pretty cool effects. So, or if they don't, you actually get some. The one on the far right, is actually the only digital one, is the bottom corner, picture of Louise there. That's a digital exposure, but that was to help me tune in the profiling to get the colour profiling correct.
So you took that digital exposure and split it in channels to the...
Yes. Yeah. In fact, that was in Photosynthesis Studio. And Louise, my wife, she was very patient. She sat for me whilst I worked out the lighting, and it was my Polaroid camera, my Nikon D, wherever it was my Polaroid. So I was able to go, oh, yeah, a bit more there, a bit more there. Yep, now get the proper camera out and take a nice shot. Okay, where are we at?
Stuart, you're using UV.
Yes.
Does it affect your skin, etc.?
My skin?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I use a sunbed. As long as I don't leave my hands or under it, it's fine. Yeah. I haven't noticed, to be perfectly honest, but I didn't take a picture 10 years ago to see. But it's UV. It's not the UVA, it's the UVB. So it's, what else? Any other quick questions? We can talk more as well once we go through next door and we'll see some prints. Yeah? Okay, any other? Are we good?
Oh, Stuart, actually, when you were doing your colour ones, what colours are you using for cyan, magenta, yellow? How are you selecting those? Are you choosing?
It's what Gordon Harris had on the shelf. They've got an ink range, Derivan ink. Actually, they've stopped stocking it, so I've got to change. It's a pigment-based ink. Yes, and it's quite a high pigment loading. In fact, you can see, those two other colour ones going around. They're made with those inks, so you can get some pretty dense colours on them. Yeah, but they've stopped stocking them, so I've got to change my inks and yeah. Any other questions?
I know you're working on CMYK, but like a little like other spot colour replacement? Or
5, yes, people are doing it, and I haven't done it yet, but people are putting like an iron red to get the skin colour. So they do CMYK plus iron red or...
I saw some guy, there's a YouTube clip, there's a guy doing like 9 colour carbon print.
That's probably one thing of Calvin, yeah.
The tonality of skin was phenomenal.
Yeah. And he's actually making separations on each colour too. So he's doing, I think, light darks on each of those 4 plus 5 colours. So yeah, the hole's pretty deep if you really want to dive down. But yeah. But part of the joy is the unpredictability in some sense. And there's a couple of prints there, I've done, and particularly when you're developing, they start to flag or frill. They start almost like they're coming off, and if you can catch it and stop it, and when it dries down, it actually gives a nice human touch as well, because it's not dead straight or it's not perfect. So there's a little bit of imperfection as well. Yeah.
What limit's the size that you can print?
I've got a 17-inch printer. So in terms of digital negatives, I can go 17 by, I think it's a metre if I want to, but 1620 is the largest. Oh, carbon print's probably 1114 are the largest ones. Yeah, it gets exponential in terms of the problems or the, yeah. And again, I've only got so much wall space, so yeah. And it's a nice size, 810 or 1114. Well, the mats are 1114, 1620, yeah, yeah. Cool. Should we go and see some magic? I think that's that's the best part. Okay. Silford's glossy paper. It's a gorgeous paper. Mr. Silver goes.
Do you feel slightly guilty fixing
I do. I do. It's such a revered paper.